step-by-step workshop on how to paint reflections in water. In this workshop we will be looking at how to paint the reflection of clouds in a river. The materials we'll be using today are gouache or acrylic. You can also use watercolour as long as you have a white paint too. The palette we will be using is a limited palette of 3 primary colours, blue, yellow and red, plus white. I'm going to put on the screen now some more of the materials you'll need. I hope you enjoy the video. We are going to be painting reflections on water. This demonstration is going to focus on how the sky and clouds are reflected. The dividing line between the reflection and the sky in this photograph is land, and it looks like it's a wheat field. So when we start a painting like this, we really want to be looking at our composition. What I will first do to start out this composition is I want to make a very thin paint. We're working with our limited palette again of just 3 primary colours, yellow, red and blue. And from those colours we can make our secondary colours, which are violet, green and orange. What I want to do first is to create a kind of a earthy type colour, and to do that I'm going to mix up some orange, and into my orange I'm going to add the smallest amount of blue. This is very close to the colour we actually see our horizon line and the land. I'm using a very fluid mix here because this is just to kind of draw or sketch out where our horizon is going to be. Now I'm looking at dividing this page, so I'm just painting that simple line across, but I also want to make it into a triangle of sorts, like so. And I'm also just going to fill up that white space here. So this is my land coming across. I'm going to add to that watery mix just the smallest amount of blue. And now with that blue, again very fluid, I'm just sketching out that top line there. The next thing I want to do is to create the darker shape which sits just beneath my field here. It's where the dividing line between the land and the water is happening. I don't want to use that green colour, I want a darker colour than that. So to do that I'll take some red, and into it I add some blue, and into that I'm going to add some yellow. It's now a rich deep orange, and into it add some more blue. So I've created a very dark colour here. So my next step is I'm just going to, at the bottom of here, again with a very fluid brush, just add a little bit of this dark colour along this line here. The next thing I want to do is to add some blue to the sky without tainting the area where my clouds are going to be. So with this I'm working again in a very much a watercolour style. So I'm adding a small amount of blue here. To that I'm going to add some white, only a small amount because it's going to be a thin layer. I'm going to start up in my sky, and I'm going to start up in this corner, and I'm going to create what is known as negative space. So up here I'm just going to wash some of this blue in, and where the clouds are I'm actually going to leave gaps. And now I want to do the same in the water. Now there's quite a big difference between the intensity of the blue. This patch here I'm going to add a much more vivid blue. Again, I'm working with the area of blue to create a negative space where the clouds are going to be. I'm looking for elements of blue in the photograph. I can see I've missed a bit up in the sky, so I'm just going to add a little bit more up there. I've created a blue area, and we will call this a negative space. A negative space works by creating the area around something, and by doing so you help to define the shape. An example of this, and I've done this in art school many years ago, is we were to draw a chair, but rather than drawing the legs of the chair, we were to draw the space in between the legs, and by doing so it automatically created the shape of a chair. My next step is to create the grey colour of the clouds. You see in these clouds that there's a lot of light involved in them, but there's also a lot of grey and tones in between grey and white. How I will do that is I've already got my very watery mix here of blue. I'm going to add a little bit of red to that blue. It's created this lovely dull violet colour. Now I'm going to do something that we've talked about in previous videos. So I'm going to work with the idea of complementary colours. In complementary colours, there are two colours that have a relationship. When put next to each other, they make the other one stand out. Those colour relationships include blue and orange, red and green, and yellow and violet. Something interesting happens, though, when you add a small amount of a complementary colour into a mix. Here you see, by adding a small amount of yellow into violet, you're creating a grey colour, and that's because the two complementaries, when mixed together, instead of complementing each other, actually cancel each other out, and we're left with this lovely grey colour. I'm going to now go into my painting, and I'm going to start first with some of the clouds that exist in the water. And I'm just going to very lightly, you see how I'm moving the brush, just sketch out some of these darker grey areas. We'll be going over these with lighter tones afterwards, but for the time being we're just laying in some lovely thin areas of grey. Okay, you can use a variety of brush marks. I'm going to go up into my sky now. There we go. I made some more grey marks, and again by here the great thing about gouache paint is that it can be used like this, like a watercolour. I'm just making marks with my brush to define some areas. Right at the bottom of my picture, it's much darker. Over here too, and then right up the top. We're working in an impressionistic way. When we create an image, there's a big emphasis on brush marks, the fluidity, the flow of the brush marks. We don't place a great emphasis on an exact replica of a photograph. I like to paint outside, and this is one of the ways I paint. The movement of the clouds, the changing in the light, cannot be predicted. In a photograph they can, because it stays the same, but we are taking an approach as though we were outside. Now to the next stage. I'm looking at my blue up here in the sky. It's closer to these greys here than anything. I want to make that slightly more intense. So I'm taking some pure ultramarine blue and I'm going to add some white to it. I'm starting to add a little bit more opacity to my mixes. So I'm going to start back up in my sky and just start layering in more opaque blue. I want to be adding a bit more white to that, because as it comes down to the horizon, the colour gets lighter. And we're working in blocks of colour, areas of colour, to help create our image. Equally, down in the water, I want to make that blue more intense. So I'm adding to my mix ultramarine blue, and I'm just going to start down in this corner and really bring some opacity to it. I'm using side to side brush strokes with this. The next thing I want to do is I want to be able to go into some of those areas that I've just added and help them blend a little bit using a wet brush. The way I'm going to do that is just dip my brush in water, take some of the excess water off with a bit of kitchen towel, and where my edges are, I'm just going to blend. Apologies to those using acrylic, this might be slightly difficult, but if you use a small amount of white paint with a wet brush, it should do a similar thing. One way to do it with acrylics is as soon as you put the colour down, then use a wet brush. So I'll give you an example of that quickly. I'm going to take some more of this strong blue here and I'm going to add it in to this area here whilst the paint is still wet. I'm rinsing my brush out, and then just where the edges are, I'm just smoothing it out, blending it out, and washing it out. Okay, so that's what you would do with acrylic. So I'm doing this with gouache, but again, if you are working with acrylic, as soon as you put your colour down, you can then blend it with the water. For our next stage, we want to start introducing some highlights. And to do this, we're going to use our pure white. We're also going to make a little grey, similar to the grey that we made up in the sky earlier, but this time we're going to actually add some white to it to make it opaque. What we want to do is take some blue, add a bit of red, just made this nice dull violet colour. I've got some white in my brush so you can see it's much more opaque than it was before. And into that, add a small amount of yellow. That's the kind of grey I'm looking for, but I want to make it much paler, so I'm adding some white to it. Now I'm going to just go over again some of the areas where clouds are, or the grey aspect of clouds are. You see, when I work kind of across the painting, not just in one area at a time, because my eyes are taking me to different places all of the time over the painting, and it helps for me to unify it. I'm using a variety of brush strokes here, but they are mostly these kind of just probing and dabbing type brush marks. And I want to just with a wet brush, just soften some of those edges. If you're using acrylic, your paint should still be wet enough for you to do this. So I'm just blending some of these little areas. Bring it right over the horizon line and into those corners. Our next step is to add some of the lighter areas of the clouds. And to do this, I've dampened my brush and I'm picking up some pure white paint. We have to use a little bit of caution here because we don't want to over lighten any aspect of our painting. I'm going to, where I can see the clouds in the sky, just with these light probing motions, gently trace the shape of some of the bodies of the clouds. What you'll find is that the grey beneath shows through some of the white that we're putting down. If you're using acrylic, it's the same effect and the same technique. Remember, it's important to leave some of that grey from underneath shining through. Whilst our paint is still wet, just with a wet brush, just dab a few of those edges, not all of them, but just a few. There's a little bit of blending going on there. Now I'm going to move on to another element where there's some white, and that is over here. And just probing with the brush, dabbing. The white isn't pure white because it's picked up some of the other colours and it's quite thin, but for the moment that's what we want. We'll add some more a little bit later. I'm going to now move down into the water. Again, look for some of those light areas. There's a real light area over here. And another over here. And again, dip our brush in water and just soften some of those edges. We want now to think of some of our darker elements. This will help give the lighter areas much more contrast. One element is this tree line that's happening over here, and the other is where the field is meeting the water. I'm going to first of all work on the tree line at the back, and looking at it on the photograph, it's greenish, so to make a green, blue and yellow. And here I'm going to rely again on one of my complementary mixes. Red and green together are complementary colours, which means they complement each other and make each other stand out and seem more vibrant. However, when you mix a small amount of a complementary into another, the intensity of each is cancelled out. So I've created a much more earthy type green by putting a little bit of red into my green. Near where my tree line is, I just want to again just feel out the shape a little bit. I'm still working with relatively fluid paints, so I'm adding some water into that. I want it slightly more watercolory. I'm going to try and make that mix slightly darker, so I'm adding some more blue and a bit more red. See how quickly that turns almost to a black colour. I want that to trace right over. Realise this needs a bit more body to it. By adding that in, it's given much more tonal contrast. Whilst I've got this dark colour here, I'm going to try and attempt to get these darker colours in here, but this colour for me is a little bit too green and drab. I'm going to add some red to that. I'm going to add in some blue, add some yellow. The whole limited palette thing is really interesting. You could quickly lose the colour you're looking for. So this is getting closer to what I want. And I'm just going to dab this area slightly. I'm going to wash out a little bit of that colour. Now, staying on the land, I want to create a nice light golden colour, which I'm going to use for this bit of light that comes across on the field. And to do that, I'm going to use some yellow. I'm going to add a little bit of white to that yellow. A touch of red. See how quickly that becomes orange. It's too orange for me, so some more yellow. And it's going to need quite a lot of white in that. I'm going to use a much drier brush technique now. And across my bit of land, this field, I'm going to start over here and just with a dryish brush, just drag it over. I'm relying on the undercolour to shine through, and then lighten that even further with some white. And just at the end, just do one drag like that. We're still working on areas of dark and light. I want to add some more shadow elements into my clouds. So I'm taking some blue, and into my blue I'm adding red to create a violet. A very beautiful and strong violet there. And using violet's complementary to cancel out that intensity, yeah, I'm adding some yellow, and we have created there a lovely grey colour. Just a small amount of white to it. And looking where the darker elements of the clouds are, they're definitely down here. See how dark that is and opaque compared to the other elements. So whilst that's still wet, rather than blending it out with water, I'm going to blend it out with white. Just take the edge of that dark cloud and bring it up into here. I can also see that there's a lovely dark shape here. Now, to mirror that up in the sky, I'm going to add some darker clouds up here. And whilst my grey is still relatively wet on the paper, I want to start adding some whiter highlights to the clouds. So I'm picking up some pure white here with just a damp brush, and over where some of those grey elements have been, I'm adding some pure white in the lightest areas. You see I'm painting with quite thick paint now on top of that grey. I don't want all of the areas to be done with thick paint, but it just adds a nice little textural detail to the painting. The layers from underneath start to come through, and you start to get that real broken type effect that you see in water. I'm just using the edge of my brush with that pure paint. I want a bit more grey up here. See, that's still wet, so I can try and blend it into the sky. This is where we make much more subtle and quick decisions around layering and adding different types of brush strokes to the painting. If you want to, you can watch what I'm doing here a few times, because this is a part that I often find quite difficult to explain, and it's where I'm working relatively fast to find little areas that need bits of adjustment and a bit more spontaneous mark making. The use of thicker paint and thinner paint to build up these layers, it's a very important part of painting. You see the little brush marks that I make that hint at clouds, suggest them. It's very impressionistic. Looking again at my area of land coming across, and realise that it still needs a little bit more depth to it. So I'm going to take some red, into which I'm going to mix some yellow, and I'm making orange. Into that I've added some blue, which is oranges complementary. It makes this lovely dark brown colour. The reeds that are being reflected in the water is something I really want to look at. It's difficult to create, so we just want to create that subtle impression. I've used a relatively dry brush to create that. I'm now going to go over with a wet brush just to try and blend that out slightly. I'm going to want a darker colour in here, so I'm adding some more blue to that orange to create close to a black. Just doing these little jaggedy marks with my brush. Right along. Now, because the yellowy colour is also mirrored in there, I'm taking some of the colour I added here, and I just want to, at the bottom, create this sense of mirroring in the water. I'm dragging a dry brush right over my surface. I'm looking also again at my land. I want to give it a little bit more depth and texture. I'm mixing up yellowy orange brown, and over near to where my tree line is, just dragging this colour over. I'm going to need some darker green in for our tree line at the back, so to make that I'm taking blue and yellow, and into that adding a small amount of red. I want to make this slightly more prominent. Just try dragging that brush over and pick up a bit more of that orangey yellow colour, and just try and flatten the shape a bit. Now, this is very much a sketch of a scene. To put the finishing touches to it, I want to make the blue down here slightly less intense. Even though it is in the photograph, it's an area that I'm not quite happy with in the painting. So I'm just mixing up some blue and white here, and I'm just going to go over my big area of blue here just to try and break it up slightly. I'm going to do the same up in this sky here. And for the final touches, I'm going to add a bit of pure white down here. There. Two. Here. And a bit more in the sky. So that is my impression of a landscape with clouds reflected in water. There are elements of the painting that I like, and lots I don't, that I would want to work on some more. The main ones I'm looking at is this area here where the field is meeting the water. I was only using just one brush for the exercise, and I found it hard to create small enough brush strokes to create that almost definite edge that separates the water and the land. Other elements I'd want to look at again is just work on my field a bit more, get that a little bit more alive, and continue to work on the clouds reflected in the water and also the sky. This really is something that I would do whilst I'm outdoors, and do it fast within 15 minutes, and then take it back to my studio to maybe work up a larger oil painting. If you've got any questions about the process, please feel free to ask. For me, the key is about learning how to loosen up a little bit and really create an impression of the scene using a variety of washes and brush strokes. Let yourself go, don't worry about getting it perfect, because the confidence comes through creating these studies. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.